When people think about the French Revolution, they often imagine a single dramatic scene, such as a roaring crowd or a falling guillotine blade. These images are powerful, but they obscure the fact that the French Revolution was not a single event, but a prolonged and unstable process. Between 1789 and 1799, France experienced repeated political and social transformations, driven by economic crisis, ideological conflict, and popular unrest. This lecture focuses on the moderate and radical phases of the revolution, roughly from 1789 to 1794, and it examines how a movement that began with constitutional reform and claims of universal rights evolved into the Reign of Terror. The central question guiding this lecture is how revolutionaries justified extreme violence while continuing to speak in the language of liberty and equality. Let's start with the crisis of the old regime. By the late 18th century, France faced deep structural problems that made reform increasingly unavoidable. The monarchy was heavily in debt due to war and extravagant spending. The tax system placed disproportionate burdens on the lower classes, and food shortages created widespread hardship. When King Louis XVI summoned the Estates General in 1789 to address the financial crisis, he unintentionally opened a political space in which long-standing grievances could be expressed. What began as a fiscal discussion quickly turned into a challenge to absolutist authority and traditional social hierarchies. One of the earliest and most symbolically significant events of the French Revolution was the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789. The Bastille was a medieval fortress in Paris that served as a state prison and symbolized royal authority and arbitrary justice. Although it only held a handful of prisoners and had little military value, it represented the king's power to imprison subjects without trial. As rumors spread that royal troops were preparing to suppress the National Assembly, Parisians armed themselves and attacked the Bastille in search of gunpowder.
Il nous faut la Bastille! Nous voulons la Bastille! Citoyens, il faut qu'ils enlèvent les canons!
Laissez passer la délégation du comité permanent de l'hôtel de ville!
Poussez-vous! Allez, par là, par là! Laissez passer ces messieurs de l'hôtel de ville! Allez, écartez-vous!
Faites-leur enlever les canons!
Qu'est-ce qu'ils mijotent?
Ils sont toujours à l'intérieur.
Prisonniers ou quoi?
J'en sais rien.
Nous voulons la Bastille!
La Bastille! Ils nous font signe d'entrée! Allons-y!
Ils ont rien compris. Ils avancent au lieu de foutre le camp.
On n'a plus le choix. En joue!
Non, ce serait un carnage. Retirez-vous!
Monsieur le gouverneur! Si vous ne faites pas tirer, nous sommes perdus.
On joue! Feu!
Feu, par Dieu!
Cessez le feu! Cessez le feu!
faites-vous?
Nous sommes sauvés.
Vive le roi! Vive la nation!
After several hours of fighting, the fortress fell. Its governor was killed, and his head was displayed publicly. The fall of the Bastille demonstrated that popular action could reshape political power and ensured that the Parisian crowd would remain a central force of the revolution. In October 1789, revolutionary violence and popular protest moved from Paris to the heart of royal power at Versailles. Rising bread prices and persistent food shortages had placed enormous strain on working class families, particularly women, who were largely responsible for purchasing and preparing food. On October 5th, thousands of Parisian women marched to Versailles to demand bread and to confront the king directly.
Si vous refusez de marcher sur Versailles pour demander au roi de nourrir son peuple, alors nous le ferons.
Allons chercher la boulangère et le boulanger! Et le petit métro!
Their protests quickly grew into a mass demonstration that included members of the National Guard. At Versailles, the crowd demanded action from the king and pressured him to endorse revolutionary reforms. Overnight, violence erupted when protesters entered the palace and killed several royal guards.
Venez, Majesté, vite. Allons nous réfugier chez le roi.
Et l'Autrichienne, tu l'accueilles? Doucement, Lothar.
Although the royal family was not harmed, the event shattered the symbolic distance between the monarchy and the people. The following day, Louis XVI agreed to move his family and court back to Paris, where they would reside in the Tuileries Palace under constant public scrutiny. The October days were a critical turning point in the revolution. By forcing the king to relocate to Paris, the crowd effectively transformed him into a prisoner of the revolution. The episode also demonstrated the political power of popular protests, particularly the role of women in revolutionary action. At the same time, it made clear that the revolution was increasingly being driven by economic desperation and crowd violence rather than the legislative debate alone. The balance of power shifted decisively away from Versailles and towards Paris, accelerating the erosion of royal authority.
À Paris! Le roi! À Paris!
Le roi accepte. Retournez à Paris et le roi...
From 1789 to 1791, the French Revolution entered what historians commonly describe as its moderate phase. During this period, most revolutionaries did not seek to abolish the monarchy, but instead aimed to reform it. The National Assembly worked to eliminate feudal privileges, establish equality before the law, and create a constitutional monarchy that limited royal authority. This phase of the revolution was characterized by optimism and faith in rational reform, as many believed that liberty, property, and political stability could coexist within a constitutional framework. Despite its rhetoric of universal rights, the revolution excluded large segments of the population from political participation, most notably women. In response to this exclusion, the writer and activist Olympe de Gouges published the Declaration of Rights of Women and the Female Citizen in 1791. In this document, she argued that women were citizens and therefore entitled to the same political rights as men. She insisted that if women were subject to law, they must have a voice in creating it, and she exposed the contradiction between the revolutionaries' ideals and its practices. De Gouges' declaration highlighted the limits of revolutionary equality and revealed tensions that would grow more severe during the radical phase. Her eventual execution during the Reign of Terror underscored how dangerous dissent had become in revolutionary France. The moderate phase of the revolution began to unravel with King Louis XVI's attempted escape from France in 1791. Although the king had accepted a constitutional role, he remained deeply opposed to many revolutionary reforms, particularly those targeting the Catholic Church. In June 1791, the royal family attempted to flee the country in order to seek foreign support and potentially organize a counter-revolution. Their escape failed when Louis XVI was recognized in a town of Venice and arrested. He was returned to Paris under armed guard, and that episode permanently damaged his credibility. The flight convinced many revolutionaries that the king was a traitor, accelerating the collapse of trust and strengthening Republic sentiment. Following the king's failed escape, political tensions intensified rapidly. In 1792, revolutionary France declared war on Austria and Prussia, hoping to defend the revolution and spread its ideals. Instead, early military failures heightened fears of invasion and internal betrayal. Political rhetoric grew increasingly extreme, and suspicion of counter-revolutionaries became widespread. In August 1792, Parisian crowds stormed the Tuileries Palace, effectively overthrowing the monarchy. Louis XVI was arrested, and France was declared a republic the following month. This moment marked the transition from the moderate to the radical phase of the French Revolution. The radical phase of the revolution reached its most extreme expression during the Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794. During this period, the revolutionary government authorized mass arrests, expedited trials, and executions of those accused of being enemies of the Republic. Revolutionary tribunals condemned nobles, priests, political rivals, and ordinary citizens alike. The guillotine became the most visible symbol of the revolutionary justice, and historians estimate that tens of thousands of people were executed. Supporters of the terror argued that France faced an existential crisis and that extraordinary measures were necessary to protect liberty from its enemies. In this way, fear became a tool of governance, and violence was redefined as justice. At the center of the terror stood Maximilien Robespierre, a leading member of the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre believed that a true republic required moral virtue and unwavering commitment to the common good. He argued that terror was not a rejection of revolutionary principles, but a necessary means of enforcing them. Under the Committee of Public Safety, power was centralized to an unprecedented degree, as the revolutionary government controlled the military, the economy, and political expression. Although the revolution claimed to represent the will of all the people, it increasingly relied on authoritarian methods to maintain unity and suppress dissent. This period revealed a central paradox of the revolution. A movement dedicated to freedom created new forms of coercion in the name of equality. By 1794, the terror had begun to turn inward, and fear spread even among revolutionary leaders. Robespierre's insistence on moral purity and his growing isolation made him a target. In July 1794, during the month of Thermidor, he was arrested and executed without trial. His death marked the end of the Reign of Terror and the collapse of the radical revolutionary government. While the revolution continued, it moved away from its most extreme policies and towards a more conservative and unstable political order. By the end of the radical phase, France was exhausted, divided, and still at war. The revolution had succeeded in destroying absolutism, feudal privilege, and the old social hierarchy, but it had failed to produce lasting political stability. Out of this instability emerged a new solution in the form of military authority. In the years that followed, Napoleon Bonaparte would rise as a figure who promised order, victory, and the preservation of revolutionary achievements without revolutionary chaos. The age of Napoleon would not end the French Revolution, but it would instead reshape it, carrying its ideals across Europe while concentrating power in the hands of one individual. The tension between liberty and authority that defined the moderate and radical phases would remain one of the revolution's most enduring legacies.